For centuries, doctors and surgeons examining or working on wounds would often tell the patient, their relatives or caretakers to watch the wound for laudable pus. Something that's laudable is good, to be appreciated. Given that until the mid-19th century people did not know what germs were, pus was a good way of understanding that a wound was infected. Unfortunately, other more serious kinds of infection, for instance, that resulting from a spear through the jaw like that sustained by famous explorer and adventurer Sir Richard Burton in Africa. He survived, by the way. He went on to translate the titillating Kama Sutra, the ancient Hindu text which surveyed sexual behavior in India. In wounds which don't develop pus, the tissue often has died, gangrene. At the time, the only remedy for gangrene was amputation, if possible. Unfortunately, wounds with laudable pus indicate the presence of infection, which people didn't realize was caused by germs, so the infection would either spread or not, all in God's hands. Besides, how could anything, much less a living thing, be invisible, unless it was supernatural? Even when proven in the mid-19th century, the idea of germs was scoffed at until about halfway through the American Civil War. When professionals became convinced, a strong public campaign on germ theory took place in the hospital tents, hospitals, and medical schools, mostly in the North. It was nurses in most instances who went out into the fields and frontline areas to educate army surgeons on the subject. By simply keeping things separated and cleaner, the mortality rate improved dramatically. What does this all have to do with our subject for today? Radiation. What about nuclear radiation, one of the most dangerous things known to man? Well, some knew. They truly did. Many chose to downplay the threat, while others knew and tried to raise the alarm the best way they could. Of course, although sophisticated beyond belief, mankind's knowledge of radiation was primitive compared to today's understanding of it. For those of you outside the USA, a bowl game usually refers to an American championship football game of some kind or another. At the time, professional football was not very popular compared to college football, and the professional football Super Bowl didn't exist until 1967. College football dominated, and many of the Marines in Nagasaki were fresh out of school, whether it was high school or college. Football then was not football now in terms of popularity, but it was still very popular, and a lot of those Marines, both officers and men, had played football in school. Football and Marines just go together too, you know? That's why, after the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, American occupational troops stationed in Japan on New Year's Day 1946 held the first annual Atom Bowl football game, on a field covered in radioactive dust and glass shards and surrounded by piles of irradiated rubble. The men and women who developed and built the first atomic bombs knew that exposure to high radiation levels could kill. Most believed that the force of the blast and the fire of an atomic explosion would kill most of the people on whom the bomb was dropped, but knew that a considerable number would die by receiving a fatal blast of radiation in the explosion's first milliseconds. They also knew that many who survived the blast and the initial burst of radiation would likely die, depending on the dose absorbed and other factors. However, they didn't fully comprehend what the long-term effects of exposure to lower levels of nuclear radiation could, and often did, do to a person over the years. A person who may have lived another 10, 20, 30 or more years had they known what rolling around the radiation-covered ground in Nagasaki might do to them. The 2nd Marines were stationed in and around Nagasaki during the early part of the American occupation of Japan. The 2nd included many college and professional football players in its ranks, and its commander, Major General Leroy Hunt, knew it and wanted a football game to be played to raise morale on the holiday. So naturally, the Marines of the 2nd were more than happy to oblige. It would be a chance to blow off some steam and build morale, whether you were playing, and yes, the spectators stood on a lot of radiation too. Stop and think about this for a moment and forget the stuff about radiation. Can you imagine American troops doing that today? Playing a football game where tens of thousands of people had just died? It would never happen. But 2023 is not 1945-46. From the start, the war in the Pacific rivaled, at least in savagery if not scale, the ethnic violence between the Germans and Russians on the Eastern Front. For the Marines in the second, many of whom were combat veterans, the thought that they shouldn't have a game there didn't enter into it. In 2005, Gerald Sanders, the last survivor of the atom bomb, gave an interview about it in which he said, "We thought it was totally appropriate and symbolic of a celebration. It was certainly not to look like there was a joyful glee in what had happened there. It had an emotional effect on us. We were there, yet we had many buddies that didn't make it through the war." Sanders, at the time a colonel, was put in charge of organizing the game. One of the team captains was Bullet Bill Osmanski, who led the NFL in rushing in 1939 as a Chicago Bear, and had been a star at Holy Cross. The other captain was the Heisman Trophy winner of 1943, Angelo Bertelli. Osmanski's team, who had played college football at Temple, Michigan State, LSU, and Northwestern. Bertelli's included players from UCLA, Colorado State, Texas Tech, and Duquesne, all known for their football programs. This wasn't just a game by guys who had played in the street. Over 2,000 Marines and other Americans, along with a few hundred Japanese civilians in the distance, watched the first annual Atom Bowl on January 1st, 1946. The game was supposed to end in a tie, per the general's orders. This was to prevent any post-game fistfights, etc. But at the last moment, Osmanski's team kicked an extra point with no time on the clock. No fights broke out, but it was a close call. But cancer did. Though the following numbers are from the US National Institutes of Health and cover Japanese cancer rates from 1958 to 1987, and we are not taking into account that the Marines were exposed to the post-blast radiation for a much shorter time, though they were not made to shower or clean their clothes afterward, the rate of cancer among survivors increased tremendously over average in the years after the war. Other than the survivors of the atomic blast in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and those who worked on the bomb and witnessed its first test, no one could fully comprehend what a nuclear blast was like. In the fear that reigned over the world in the aftermath of both the American use of the atomic bomb and the Soviet Union's development of one, there were many differing ideas about surviving a nuclear blast. Nuclear weapons became more and more powerful throughout the 1950s. By 1959, the size of the average nuclear warhead in the arsenals of the nuclear powers of the time, the USA, USSR, Great Britain, France, China did not develop nuclear weapons until 1964, dwarfed the power of what had been dropped in Japan in 1945. But the idea that people in targeted areas could survive lasted for years after nuclear payloads made it unlikely. Where there's a need, there is a salesman ready to make money. Watching TV, a newsreel at the movies, reading a newspaper or magazine, you would see constant reminders of the danger in the world and what many people thought you could do about it. Let's introduce you to some of the advertisements you would regularly see in the 1950s and much of the 60s.
A fallout shelter you can build yourself is open for public inspection in Thomasville, Georgia. This above-surface model was designed for areas where rocks or water make underground construction impractical.
Duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. Paul and Patty know this. No matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb. Duck and cover.
Now, our scriptwriter Matthew is going to share a scary lesson he learned growing up. I was born in 1963, and while I don't remember seeing suburban bomb shelters themselves, in New York City, where I spent my first few years, there were signs with the radiation symbol and the words bomb shelter every few corners. They were mostly basements, though subways could have been used. Still, pretty much certain death. Through 8th grade 1978, we had to have air raid warnings once a year in school. We didn't do duck and cover, because by that time, people knew it was at least a little safer than sitting in a class with windows to go in the hallway. My first best history teacher was a younger guy, and when we all stood up to go in the hallway, he's like, "Where are you going?" "The hall for air raid." And he said something almost exactly like this: "Look, you dummies, if a bomb is dropped on New York City," which by then I was in suburban New Jersey, "we're all going to die. So if you want to go see the lockers melt in front of your eyes before you go, then have at it. Otherwise, we're not doing that anymore." Never did. It was kind of funny at the time. We thought more about what a cool teacher we had, and in the back of our minds, we knew that there was really no way for us to survive a nuclear attack on the New York metropolitan area, the center of world finance. But that night, a lot of us ended up staring at the ceiling, really pondering the possibility of Armageddon for the first time in our lives. You learn pretty quickly after that ultimately there's nothing you can do to survive that type of war. So a few years later, as troublemaking teenagers, we would get some beer and wine and take a little trip. Our town and virtually every town in America used to test their air raid sirens every week. Ours was on Tuesday at noon. From time to time, my friends and I held nuclear drills of our own. During the summer and school breaks, we would occasionally take that beer and wine, go to the top of one of the tallest hills in the woods around us, where on a clear day you could see New York City, and wait until we heard the air raid siren go off. Then we'd look out over New York's skyline and get smashed waiting for the bomb to drop. Heck of a childhood. In 1983, the movie The Day After aired on TV. Starring Jason Roberts and John Lithgow, the movie, coming at a time of increased nuclear tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, was a horrifying and realistic depiction of what the aftermath of a nuclear attack on the United States would be like. Already gaining popular support, the anti-nuclear movement of the 1980s gained much more support after people watched the movie. And not one of the silly newsreels that suggested that people could survive a full-scale nuclear attack, which continued into the 80s. By this time, most people ignored them completely.